we're going to do now is we're going to look at some scenarios that might come into your life on placement, and we're going to discuss how you might address those scenarios with reference to this, talking about sort of sources we could pull from these places on the continuum. We've deliberately got a first one that's quite nuts and boltsy, and a second one that is quite big philosophically. So we might find ourselves floating around in slightly different amounts and places on that continuum, depending on whether we're talking quite nuts and boltsy or something much bigger picture.
Before we go there, is there anything on this list that you don't understand what it means in the context of teacher education or classroom teaching? Becca?
The research findings and conclusions, is that our own research and the findings from that, or other people's?
You would tend to be here probably, because you would tend to deliver your research, do your research in a classroom. The one down at number 8 is when you've got pure academic education researchers who might be studying multiple schools or looking at data or something like that. And the gold standard of academic research is that it's generalisable. In other words, you can be fairly sure it's going to be applicable in lots of places. Whereas at number 4, actually, you don't care if it's generalisable because you just want it working in your own classroom. So that's the kind of difference between those.
Yeah, which is classroom action research is incredibly powerful. And as a tiny little anecdote, that's when the magic started to happen in my own practice, because we didn't do this stuff when I trained, but I was lucky that halfway through when I was teaching, we were linked up with the University of Warwick, and I was looking at Shakespeare in the classroom, and I had to do some of my own action research with a very small sample of my year 10 pupils in order to look at a specific aspect of my practice. And I've got to say, that's where the magic and the flame was lit again underneath me, because I'd been dwelling mostly in between 1 to 3 at that point after I graduated, and things were getting stale. Okay, and as soon as that happened, and I went to 4, magic started happening, and I felt more invigorated as a practitioner. Anything else on that list that is not obviously clear? Okay, so we're going to keep it on the screen, but we're going to give you a scenario. Scenario 1, and this is the nuts and boltsy one that maybe you'll be really worried about when you start clinical practice 1. How do I get them in? How do I get them in to start? So student X, as you can see, has received feedback about the way they start their lessons and the impact on pupils' readiness for learning. Now, you might have this sort of feedback when you start team teaching or when you start teaching, and your mentor might say to you, right, the pace of the entry is too slow, it's disorganised, they're not ready for learning, it impacts negatively on the rest of the lesson, you need to set routines and stick to them. So they've given you some kind of craft knowledge feedback there. They've articulated to you what the issue is. You have maybe done some reflection yourself as well. Maybe you did a reflective model and you identified that pupils are really poorly behaved at the start of the lesson when they're lining up, and it's making it difficult for me to regain their attention for the register and the starter activity, and they're climbing the walls, and then everything goes to hell in a handcart. Okay? Nuts and boltsy. So the thing that we want you to discuss, bearing in mind that you've got lots of different forms of knowledge that you might draw upon in your research and inquiry time to help you deal with this problem. Imagine you're student X. What approaches, what sources might student teacher X use to help address this problem and this target from the mentor?
I'm thinking particularly, let's imagine you're early on, because this is the kind of thing that happens early on, although it does also happen frequently throughout your career. Say you've got those 4 hours in school, free from teaching, to use as you wish. What are you going to do with those 4 hours?
So I think the easiest way to do this is to just find a neighbour or neighbours near to you. It doesn't have to have that mix, but even better if it does have that mix, but we'll take loads of time reassembling ourselves if we do that. So just turn to people around you, have that chat, few minutes on this, and then we'll gather some feedback from you, please. So find people around you, have a chat. If you need to move closer and break social distancing, then stick your masks on.
Okay, right, let's stop there. So, a couple of quick interesting things that came out of eavesdropping on some discussions. I had a lovely question about just clarifying what we meant by number 2, the articulation of craft knowledge. It's really important to bear in mind that someone who's been in the classroom, well, even 5 years actually, but certainly 10, 15, 20 years, they will do certain teachery things automatically. So automatically. It's a bit like driving a car. You don't know you're doing half the things that you're doing like you did when you were learning, when you're having to concentrate on every single tiny little thing. Now you just do it. It's the same with teaching, and actually one of the reasons that a lot of us chose to become student teacher subject mentors, as I was before I came and worked here, was that actually we found that it was really beneficial when you had a student teacher who was struggling with something to actually explain what you were doing. I used to actually like to think, well, actually, yeah, they do get in and line up properly and quietly in my corridor. So why is that? What is it that I do? Because I didn't actually know, because it had all sort of gone into the automatic realm, and I found it very useful to articulate that to somebody else because it had just disappeared into the back of my brain somewhere. So that's kind of what we mean by that, and mentors will do that brilliantly for you and enjoy it.
But you might need to ask them to, because that tacit knowledge that Tom's talking about, where you're unconsciously competent of all those things that you're doing, like driving a car, completely unconsciously competently doing it, you might need to explicitly say, why do you make them do a uniform check when they're stood in the line outside? Or why do you do tiny, tiny little detail that you've picked up on? And then they will tell you. One of the most humble things that is suggested that you do as part of research and inquiry time is have a learning conversation with a colleague. And we often refer to that as a survival cuppa. But that is really important, okay? And sometimes your mentor will be very busy, and you might need to kind of catch them in the moment and say, why did you do that? But ask the question. There are no silly questions to draw out that articulation of craft knowledge.
Yeah, so the very first time I watched a lesson as a student teacher with my mentor, this beautiful lesson happened in front of me, and I kind of was at the back going, I can never do that. And I said, Carol, how is it that you get them and they just do everything you say? And she just turned to me and went, because I've been teaching longer than you've been alive, Tom. And that was the reason. I mean, looking at this then, spoiler alert, when year 9 set 8 turn up again the following week, you probably aren't going to walk out of your room and say, right, year 9, according to a study of in 1992 in 4 schools in Wyoming, the use of a restorative behaviour management approach gained a 5% increase in the attitudes towards learning of pupils from lower ability classes. So, what are you going to do?
What are you going to do in reality to address this problem? You've got research and inquiry time. How are you going to use that to try and get better the next time you have to teach year 9?
Well, it's just trial and error from what you learned. You read what the statistics are telling you to do. You give it a go, and if it works for you, then good. Often it might not, but you just learn through practice.
Okay, so we've got doing a bit of reading, practicing based on you've read, and trying to see if that's working. Jess, what else?
With the trial and error as well, you have to remember that it might work with one class and one school, but it might not work in a different school with a different class. So it's important to do the trial and error in every single class or school that you go into.
Good point. Excellent point. So you might do a bit of kind of comparative reflection there and go, okay, mate, how am I going to tweak that with that other class? So you're thinking critically about why it's working for one and how you need to tweak it for the other. Okay, what else, Molly?
You'd ask teachers who also teach that class or classes similar, because so we were saying for this, research is brilliant, but for specific cases like this, it's probably not going to be that applicable. And also, if you're lucky enough to be paired with a teacher who has a lot of experience, they'll probably tell you exactly the same thing that the research would tell you anyway.
Boom.
So it saves time in reading, but also it means that you get that direct feedback rather than having to apply research to it.
Excellent point. And maybe they've got a form tutor who you don't know, and it would be really good because those form tutors will probably know that class so well. So speaking to them would probably be a good idea too. What other ideas do you have, Kerry?
Kind of what we
we chatted about here, using your research and inquiry time to maybe observe kind of in that, for half a day, observe like the beginning of classes to see how other teachers get students in and settled.
Yeah.
And then from that, gather kind of all the information and then choose which one maybe you'd be best at and which one would work with which students.
Yeah, which is much more purposeful and focused than just going, I'm just going to observe everything. I'm going to observe everything and hopefully some stuff will stick. If you know that your particular area of focus is something like this, then doing a 20-minute focused observation a few times of that group in different subject contexts, or that group at different times of the day, or different teachers doing entry routines, is potentially going to help you much more than just observing everything. So it's about making that research and inquiry time purposeful to what you're trying to improve, reflect or develop, okay?
And you can still be critical, even though we're looking down at that end of the continuum, you can still approach this critically, because you can say, okay, that was fab, but that's a maths classroom and it's getting them to sit down and open their books, and I'm a music teacher and I've got a room full of DJ buttons and tambourines. So it's going to work up to a point. Or he's a massive, scary 6'4" professional rugby player and I'm 5'3" and haven't got a very loud voice. So that's going to work, but you can still look at it critically and work out how applicable it is to you.
Yeah, and the difficulty will be, navigating some of those challenging conversations with your mentor, which might be, you do it like this, but I don't feel comfortable adopting that teacher persona. So your mentor might be authoritarian, real presence, uses shouting a lot and it works for them, but you might not feel comfortable in those shoes. So this is where research and inquiry is feeding into your philosophy, your identity. Navigating those conversations might be challenging, but that's where university tutor comes in if you need to. That's where we come in if you need to. Okay, that's where you have to start developing your own professional autonomy and be brave. Becca?
And looking at the school's particular policies around like discipline and things like that, so there's a continuation past class, so you're not sticking out like a sore thumb with your approach, you have to adapt.
Brilliant.
Absolutely. Policy is subject to critique as well, but you need to understand it will be your friend when you start, because if it's being applied consistently, the pupils should feel very comforted and safe by that, because they know that when they go to Katie's class, they're going to get the same progression of sanctions as if they went to, music class, Bethany's class, I will learn, and they're going to get the same, maybe tweaked slightly for subject context, but we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. Bethany?
We were saying how you might not know it, but we kind of remembered how our old teachers used to get us into the class.
Mm-hmm.
We used to have mine was just open the door, so silent, until we all realised, our teacher's here. And then we all left them silent, and having a Beth was saying how they had to do it, come on, like, right, okay, year 7, and being really spoken at. So how you might have known it, you take that in and you might use what they used to use.
Yes, yeah. So it might cause some sort of internal sort of retrospective reflection on what you experience, what is feeding into why you're behaving the way you're behaving, because you will default to something without any advice. A novice will either just abort or default to something that they've experienced or seen, because that's what we do. We look for patterns, we try and make sense of things in order to survive. We are, trying to survive at the end of the day. On that note, we're going to move on. We're going to move on to
just one more
Oh
thing,
yeah,
just
go.
I want
Sorry,
to definitely
go.
make sure we mention this.
Yeah.
You are allowed to practice as well as a teacher. Now, when we trialled research and inquiry a couple of years ago, one of the criticisms that came back from some schools was they don't need to be doing research and inquiry, they just need to be teaching lessons, and then they'll sort it out, they'll get the nuts and bolts if they just teach loads of lessons. And I completely get that point of view. I absolutely do. And particularly for something like this, you probably are going to want to practice a lot. It is a valid research and inquiry activity if your mentor's okay with it. If you were to say, please could I just borrow your year 9 for the first 10 minutes and get them in and get them quiet and take the register and then hand them over to you, even if they're not on your timetable. And if the mentor's okay with that, that's a research and inquiry activity. And that's sort of Once we explained that to subject mentors, they were kind of okay with that. It doesn't help. It's not an efficient way to sort out a problem with the first 5 minutes of a lesson to teach lots of 60-minute lessons. It's better to practice in a really, really focused way. You can also team teach. If, like driving a car, the mental load is getting a bit much because you're trying to remember that, and that, get the mentor to do some of those things while you just concentrate on the bit that you are struggling with. And so sometimes your research and inquiry time might actually take place in front of a class.
Which, looking under the bonnet of our session, the hatty stuff about the effect size blows my mind. So Tom does that bit. So, we want to expose these things to you because from the outside looking in, it might look seamless, but it's through dialogue, community collaboration that we do our job as well as we can. Okay, trickier one here. Not necessarily a tricky one, but just needs more time to unpack. So student X has begun clinical practice 2. So this is somebody who's experienced teaching in clinical practice 1 in a different school. They have noticed that pupils come to music or drama in their English ability sets. Okay, so they are grouped by ability based on their English ability sets. But for placement 1, when the student teacher was teaching there, it was mixed ability. So they've noticed there's a difference in the way that pupils can be organised. We want you to chat about what might be the advantages, disadvantages and differences between these two approaches. But then also, again, how might you use your research and inquiry time, so the sources or approaches that might help Teacher X make sense of what's going on, okay? So a bit knottier, a bit more difficult to unpack, but try and have a chat about that.
Okay, this is a really different one. I don't know whether you've kind of worked out this. This is not I need to solve a problem by the next time Year 9 Set 5 walk in through my door next week. And it's probably not going to be gift wrapped and fixed within a week. This is probably a bit more of a long-term, no straight answers kind of thing. But it's still the sort of thing you'd want to unravel, perhaps. So has anyone got any thoughts on this one? Beth?
We talked about like differentiation. So in the mixed ability group, you know that there's going to be a range.
Yes.
But with the English group, it's different because it's a different subject. But then the benefit of that is they already know each other. They work together in a different lesson.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of said we could go away and research differentiation, or we could observe them in their English lesson as well, see how they get on, and compare it to our music lesson.
Very nice. Set groups are a bit weird. I used to have to teach set groups. From the point of view of music, the top set was huge. There were well over 30 of them. They were very risk averse. They didn't like getting things wrong, so they wouldn't take risks in a creative subject. The bottom set only had 3 people in it, which meant that some things that you planned you couldn't do. The sort of set 3 of 8 were often the ones that were the best at music because they were slightly less risk averse, but they were often also the worst behaved. Very interesting.
Kind of going off the back of what you just said, I think a disadvantage of having teaching a set kind of group in music and drama is it means that you're only getting kind of potentially only a limited amount of perspectives, because drama and music isn't only about analysing text, it's about kind of using your imagination, being creative. So like having a mixed ability group of all kind of abilities, like it allows kind of to have like different perspectives of how you'd approach, like let's say improv or kind of creating something musical.
Yeah, and we're kind of touching on things like the classroom dynamics and how we engineer and work with those dynamics when we're given these scenarios that we have no control over, and then how we respond to them in our own practice takes time and energy and effort to think about that isn't always just on the job, turn up and teach. there was a student of mine last year who did her assignment 2, which is going to be on something that you're particularly interested in, on grouping in mixed ability classes in drama. And she got some very, very small samples of pupil voice on this, and tried to have a look, again, manageable sample, at a range of different types of pupils' views about working in mixed groups versus ability groups, which you've got control, because we know that even if they come to us in ability sets, there will still be a range of ability in that top set, particularly in our subjects, for all the reasons that we know about our subject. So this one is one that will not be once and done in an hour, 3 hours, 50 hours of research and inquiry. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not something that you could either investigate for assignment 2, because you really want to go deep on it, or use some of that research and inquiry time to try and get under the skin of a bit more deeply, using all of those different types of knowledge that McIntyre prescribes or articulates. So let's try and bring this into land a little bit now. You've got the clinical practice guide. If you have a look on pages 18 to 19, you will notice that we have tried to give more of a description of the sorts of activities that you will engage in, and how that will relate to the time that you spend on your timetable when you're on clinical practice. But you'll see on page 18, number 3 is research and inquiry. And there's a list there of particular things that might be assigned to you to do as research and inquiry, might be prescribed by us as university. You can see school-led training day, directed tasks. You'll have to do some reading for those school-led training days. You can use some of your research and inquiry time to do that. Subject and phase research and inquiry tasks. We're going to be giving you 4 bespoke research and inquiry tasks that are rooted in subject. Reflections on formal learning and teaching observations and progress reviews. So you will have to spend some of that time getting ready for progress reviews, but also once you've had a formal lesson observation, you're going to want to spend some time unpicking your mentor's feedback and thinking about how you're going to move forward on that. So there'll be some things that are prescribed, and others, if you look on page 19, that are bespoke. And often when we look to the week by week breakdown, you will get a stock phrase in your column for the student teacher that will say, you've got time this week for bespoke research and inquiry. And that's everything that we've been talking about in these 2 scenarios that you've come up with. Things like observing experienced teachers, things like observing closely learners. You could ask your mentor to teach a lesson, and you can say, I'm just going to be supporting because I really just want to watch learner reactions to this particular part of the lesson that you're teaching. All the way up to things like learning rounds, lesson study, which have got quite a lot of research underneath them and are quite too complex for me to describe to you now, but you will find out more about as we go through the programme. Reading is one of them. Reading is on the list, okay? So that's that. Another one that's important, we talked about this, but is the exemplar timetables, and that's on 11 to 12, and you can see that research and inquiry time has been factored in on a weekly basis, and if you're not getting that on your timetable, that will be something to flag up to your Link University tutor, okay, because it's a minimum entitlement that you get that time as we've dictated in the clinical practice guide. And then finally, if you click to pages 26 and 27, what we've done is we've given you a week by week guide and breakdown of what you definitely need to be thinking about and preparing for in that week. You'll see in week 26 there's a column for the student teacher that tells them what they need to do, tells you what you need to do, and you'll see it says there is research and inquiry time that can be used to carry out bespoke research and inquiry, okay? And somebody asked, I think earlier on, could that potentially be related to assignment 1 or assignment 2? Yes, it can. Okay, and you can see there that it could include a learning conversation with your mentor about your focus that's been given by the research champion for assignment 1. And then if you look to page 27, in that week, you can see that we've prescribed some research and inquiry activities. The second bullet point says you also have time to complete subject/phase specific research and inquiry. So for my Dramala, I'll be giving you your first research and inquiry task that's drama specific. It'll be reading an article and speaking to your mentor about what you found, and likewise Tom will have a similar one but in the context of music. So that's how it plays out in terms of the clinical practice guide and how we guide you in that. But don't worry, we'll give you more on this as we go through the programme. Next Monday, you've got a lead lecture about introduction to clinical practice, where the clinical practice guide will be mentioned again. So this will be a bit of a Bible, and use it, and if you can, make sure you're following it and getting it in front of your mentor's nose, because it's really useful for them. We obviously advocate that they download a copy too, but sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And finally, just to kind of hit home what we've been trying to convey to you here, and it's that on the course you're going to do assignments, and they are kind of formal research that you will do, research and inquiry, but can be done in research and inquiry time. Research and inquiry on clinical practice, it's constant. It can be very personal to you, so it might be something that you really want to address in your practice, or something that your mentor has told you needs to improve. And it's up to you to kind of drive a lot of that. And R&E may also be the process of making it applicable in your own context, of going, okay, this is what the research says, this is what my mentor says, this is what Tom and Emma said at university, what does this mean for me and my learners? So it's about kind of translating all of that into what you decide to do going forward. Tom?
Finally, 2 highly philosophical quotes. We just want to make it really, really clear, we sort of hinted at a minute ago, that research and inquiry is not going to be a once and done gift wrap thing. It's also hopefully not just going to be a thing you do this year, even though you've got time allocated for it. We're hoping it will create a culture where you want to carry it on, because it will make you a better teacher, it will make you a longer lasting teacher. One of the downers of doing our job sometimes is we will give you stuff sometimes which you can use the very next day in school, or the very next working day in school. Sometimes we will give you stuff that will plant a seed that it may not come out for 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. You might in 5 years be in a position to have a really serious conversation with your senior management about the fact you've got ability groups. You're not going to be having that conversation while you're doing your PGC if you've got any sense. Some stuff you'll wonder why we've done it, probably, and then 5 years' time you'll probably go, now I know why they did that thing I thought was completely pointless back in the PGCE. So this thing needs to kind of carry on and grow, in order that some of the stuff that doesn't always make sense in the first 9 months of your career can make sense a little bit further on. And Stenhouse kind of puts that really, really well in the same paper that the Continuum came from, the McIntyre.